The hooves stopped at the river. 1879, the border between Arkansas and Indian Territory, somewhere around midnight. 7 men on horseback, white hoods pulled tight over their faces, torches extinguished, rifles across their laps. They sat in silence, listening to the water, listening to the darkness, making sure nobody had followed them. The leader, a man named Virgil Tate, raised his hand, pointed across the water. Once we cross that river, no sheriff, no posse, no lawmen in Arkansas can touch us. We do what we came to do, and we disappear into the territory. Nobody follows us in there. They crossed the river one by one, horses splashing through the shallow current. On the other side, they regrouped on the muddy bank, hoods dripping, confidence rising. They were in Indian Territory now, Cherokee land, Choctaw land, a vast wilderness of hills, forests, and creek beds that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. No local police, no county jurisdiction, no law but what a man carried in his holster. At least that is what they believed. They had no idea that the most dangerous lawman in American history was about to receive a piece of paper with their names on it. They had no idea that the man hunting them would be black. And they had absolutely no idea that not a single one of them would make it home free. Let me tell you the story of the night the Ku Klux Klan rode into Indian Territory and ran straight into Bass Reeves. If you think you know how this ends, you do not. Because what happened in those hills over the next 6 days was more intense, more calculated, and more satisfying than anything Hollywood has ever put on screen. This is real. Every detail, every mile, every set of shackles. Stay with me. To understand what happened, you need to understand where it happened. In the late 1870s, Indian Territory was the most lawless stretch of land in the United States. Present-day eastern Oklahoma. Over 70,000 square miles of dense forest, open prairie, rocky hills, and river bottoms that provided perfect cover for every kind of criminal imaginable. Outlaws, horse thieves, murderers, whiskey runners, fugitives from justice in a dozen states, they all fled into the territory because they knew one simple truth. Local law could not follow them across the border. State warrants meant nothing on tribal land. County sheriffs had no jurisdiction. For most criminals, crossing into Indian Territory was like walking through a door and locking it behind them. Almost nobody came after you. Almost nobody. There was one court, one judge, and one deputy marshal who did not care about that invisible line on the map. The court was the United States District Court for the Western District of Arkansas. Sitting in Fort Smith, the judge was Isaac C. Parker. History remembers him as the hanging judge, and the name was earned. In 21 years on the bench, Parker sentenced 160 men to death, 79 of them hanged. His jurisdiction covered the entire Indian Territory, and he took that responsibility with a seriousness that terrified every outlaw west of the Mississippi. Parker did not negotiate. Parker did not show leniency to men who preyed on the weak. Parker signed warrants and sent men to bring fugitives back, dead or alive, but preferably alive, because Parker wanted trials. He wanted the world to see that even in the wildest territory in America, the law had reach. And the man Parker trusted most to reach into that darkness and pull criminals out was Bass Reeves. Now stop for a second and think about this. We are talking about the 1870s and 1880s. Reconstruction is collapsing. The rights that Black Americans had briefly gained after the Civil War are being stripped away across the South. The Ku Klux Klan is terrorizing black communities with impunity. Lynchings are rising. Voting rights are disappearing. And in the middle of all of this, a black man, a former enslaved person, is wearing a United States Deputy Marshal badge, carrying federal warrants, and arresting white criminals, including Klansmen, and dragging them back to face a judge. That is not a movie plot. That is Bass Reeves. That is history. Bass Reeves was born into slavery in 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas. His enslaver, Colonel George Reeves, took him to Texas during the Civil War. At some point during the conflict, Bass escaped. The details vary, depending on the source. Some say he struck the colonel during a card game dispute. Others say he simply seized the opportunity when the chaos of war provided cover. What is certain is that Bass Reeves fled into Indian Territory, lived among the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Seminole nations, learned their languages, learned the land, learned every trail and creek and hiding place across those 70,000 square miles. He learned to track like the men who had lived on that land for generations. He learned to shoot with both hands, ambidextrously, with a precision that became legendary. He learned to survive alone in the wilderness for weeks at a time. When the war ended and Reconstruction began, Reeves settled near Van Buren, Arkansas. He farmed. He raised a family. He lived quietly. But in 1875, when Judge Parker arrived in Fort Smith and began appointing deputies to enforce federal law in Indian Territory, Parker needed men who knew the land, who spoke native languages, who could track and survive in conditions that would break ordinary men. Someone told Parker about Bass Reeves. Parker sent for him, and Bass Reeves pinned on a badge that he would wear for 32 years. Over those 3 decades, Reeves arrested more than 3,000 fugitives. He was shot at countless times. He had his hat brim shot off. He had his belt shot in half. He had horses killed under him. He was never wounded. Not once. He killed 14 men in the line of duty, every single one in self-defense. He brought in outlaws that entire posses had failed to capture. He rode into camps alone. He used disguises so elaborate that men he was hunting sat across from him at campfires and never suspected a thing. Bass Reeves dressed as a farmer, as a preacher, as a drifter, as an old man. He once walked 17 miles in worn-out shoes, pretending to be a lost traveler, just to get close enough to a fugitive to serve a warrant. Think about that for a moment. A black man in the post-Civil War American frontier, riding alone into the most dangerous territory in the country, hunting armed fugitives, many of them white, many of them violently racist, and bringing them back alive to face trial. Every single ride into that wilderness was a potential death sentence. And Bass Reeves did it over 3,000 times. Now, let me ask you something. How is this man not in every American history textbook? How is Bass Reeves not as famous as Wyatt Earp or Billy the Kid? Drop that answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you think. Now, September 1879, Fort Smith, Arkansas. The story that brought you here. It started with a woman named Clara Mills. Clara was a freedwoman, formerly enslaved, who had settled with her husband James, and their 3 children on a small homestead about 12 miles south of Fort Gibson in Indian Territory. After the Civil War, thousands of black families had moved into the territory, some as freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes, others seeking land and opportunity in a place where they believed the old terrors of the South could not follow them. The Mills family had built a cabin, cleared land, planted crops. James worked as a blacksmith for a Cherokee community nearby. Clara raised chickens, sold eggs, taught their children to read using a Bible and an old copy of Frederick Douglass's autobiography. They were building something, quietly, carefully, hopefully. On the night of September 11th, 1879, 7 riders appeared on the ridge above the Mills homestead just after sundown. White hoods, torches, rifles. James Mills was in the barn when he heard the horses. He came to the door and saw them lined up on the ridge like a jury delivering a verdict. One of them shouted, "This land belongs to white men. You have 3 days to leave, or we will burn everything you own and hang you from that oak tree out front." James grabbed his rifle, fired 1 shot into the air. The riders scattered into the tree line but did not leave. They circled the property for 2 hours, firing shots into the air, riding past the cabin windows, making sure the family understood that this was not a suggestion. Clara held her children on the floor of the cabin. The youngest was 4 years old. At midnight, the riders left. But before they did, they nailed a wooden cross wrapped in kerosene-soaked rags to the Mills's front door and set it ablaze. James put it out with a blanket before the cabin caught fire, but the message was clear. You are not safe here. You will never be safe here. We can come back whenever we want. James Mills did something that took extraordinary courage. Instead of running, instead of packing up his family and disappearing, he rode to Fort Smith, 60 miles on horseback in 2 days. He arrived at the federal courthouse on September 13th, exhausted, terrified, but determined. He told the clerk everything: the hoods, the torches, the threat, the burning cross. The clerk brought the report directly to Judge Parker. Parker read it in his chambers. His face did not change. His voice did not rise. He simply picked up his pen, signed 7 federal arrest warrants for conspiracy, intimidation, and assault under the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, the very laws Congress had passed specifically to combat the Ku Klux Klan, and called for his chief deputy. Get me Reeves. Bass Reeves was already in Fort Smith, having returned 2 days earlier from a 3-week ride that had produced 6 arrests and 0 casualties. He was resting, cleaning his weapons, planning to visit his family. When the message came from Parker's court, Reeves walked to the courthouse within the hour. Parker handed him the warrants. 7 men crossed from Arkansas into Indian Territory to terrorize a black family. They are still in the territory. I want them brought back to this courthouse alive. Can you do that? Reeves looked at the warrants, looked at the descriptions, looked at the map Parker had marked with the approximate location of the Mills homestead and the direction the riders had gone. Reeves folded the papers and put them inside his coat. I will leave at dawn. Parker studied him for a moment. These are Klan, Bass, or something close to it. They will not come quietly. They never do, Reeves replied, but they always come. Reeves left Parker's office, walked to the livery stable, checked his horses, a big sorrel gelding and a pack mule, loaded supplies for 10 days, and went to bed. At 4:30 in the morning on September 14th, before the sun had touched the horizon, Bass Reeves rode west out of Fort Smith, crossed the Poteau River, and entered Indian Territory. He rode alone. This was not unusual. Reeves preferred working alone or with a single postman, usually a cook and wagon driver, who stayed behind at a base camp while Reeves tracked on foot or horseback. On this ride, he brought one man, a Creek freedman named Levi Johnson, who had worked with Reeves on previous assignments. Johnson drove the supply wagon and would wait at a designated point while Reeves moved ahead. Reeves covered ground quickly. He knew the trails between Fort Smith and Fort Gibson, the way most men know the streets of their own neighborhood. Every creek crossing, every ridge, every stand of timber that could hide a camp. By the evening of September 15th, Reeves had reached the Mills homestead. James Mills had not returned yet. Clara was there with the children and 2 neighbors who had come to help keep watch. When Reeves rode up to the cabin, Clara came to the door holding a shotgun. She saw the badge. She saw the man. She lowered the weapon. You are the marshal they sent. Bass Reeves, Moan? United States Deputy Marshal. I am here about the men who threatened your family. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry. She was past crying. She was in the place beyond tears, where only anger and exhaustion remain. They went north. After they left our place, they rode north. My neighbor, Samuel Crow, a Cherokee man, saw them on the old military road heading toward Tablecoa. They were loud, drunk, laughing. One of them was bragging about how no lawman would follow them into the territory. Reeves nodded, took out a small notebook. How many? 7, all on horseback. They had torches and rifles. 2 of them had pistols in belt holsters. Did you see any faces? One of them. His hood slipped when his horse stumbled. White man, maybe 40 years old, red beard, scar on his left cheek. Clara paused. I will never forget that face. Reeves wrote it down. Red beard, scar, left cheek, approximately 40 years old. He thanked Clara, told her that federal marshals would check on the homestead regularly until the matter was resolved, and rode north. He had a trail. He had a direction. And he had something else. Patience. The kind of patience that only a man who has tracked thousands of fugitives through wilderness can possess. The kind that says, I do not need to rush because you are not as smart as you think you are, and you will make mistakes, and when you do, I will be right behind you. Subscribe if you are enjoying this story, because it is about to get intense. Reeves followed the trail north along the old military road toward Tablequa, the capital of the Cherokee Nation. He read the ground the way a scholar reads a book. 7 horses, shod, heavy riders. The tracks showed a group moving fast at first, then slowing, then stopping. Reeves found their first camp on the evening of September 16th, a clearing about 2 miles east of the road. Cold fire pit, 7 distinct bedrolls. Whiskey bottles, 3 of them, smashed against a rock. Cigarette butts. And something Reeves recognized immediately. Boot prints. Factory-made boots. Working men's boots. Not the moccasins or rough leather boots common in the territory. These were boots bought in a town, probably Fort Smith or Van Buren, Arkansas's men. Reeves studied the camp for an hour. Found where they had tied their horses. Found droppings that told him the horses were grain-fed, not grass-fed. Town horses. Found a scrap of cloth, white cotton, torn and stained with sweat, part of a hood. He folded it carefully and put it in his saddlebag. Evidence. Then he kept riding. The second day of tracking, September 17th, Reeves encountered a Cherokee farmer named George Six-Skiller near a creek crossing. Reeves spoke Cherokee fluently. He greeted the man in his own language, asked about travelers. Six-Skiller was immediately more forthcoming than he would have been with a white marshal. 7 white men came through 2 days ago, heading toward Bayou Menard. One of them stopped at my place, asked for water. He was nervous, kept looking behind him like he expected someone to follow. Did he say anything? Said they were hunters. But they had no game, no hunting dogs, and they rode like men who did not know this land. City men playing at being frontiersmen. George laughed. They will not last a week out here. They will not need to, Reeves said. I will have them before that. Reeves adjusted his course toward Bayou Menard, a marshy lowland area about 15 miles northeast. Difficult terrain. Dense timber. Limited sight lines. A good place to hide if you did not know the land. A terrible place to hide if the man hunting you did. On the morning of September 18th, Reeves found their second camp. This one was more permanent. A crude shelter built from branches. A fire pit with warm ashes. They had been here recently, maybe hours ago. Reeves dismounted, examined the site with the focus of a surgeon examining a patient. He found something important, a receipt, crumpled, partially burned, but readable, from a general store in Van Buren, Arkansas, dated September 8th, 3 days before the raid on the Mills homestead, purchased by V. Tate, rope, kerosene, ammunition. Reeves smoothed the receipt and added it to his evidence. Virgil Tate. Now he had a name. Let me ask you something. Can you imagine being one of those 7 men sitting around a fire in the middle of Indian Territory, convinced you are beyond the reach of any law, and having no idea that a man was reading your campfire ashes like a newspaper, following your every step, carrying federal warrants with your name on them? That thought alone should keep you watching, because what Reeves did next was pure genius. On the afternoon of September 18th, Bass Reeves stopped tracking. He changed clothes, took off his marshal's coat, removed his badge, put on a worn-out cotton shirt, patched trousers, a battered hat, and old shoes with holes in the soles. He rubbed dirt on his face and hands, wrapped his revolvers in cloth, and hid them in a flour sack tied to his saddle. He left his Winchester with Levi Johnson at the base camp. Then he took his oldest, most tired-looking horse, loaded it with a pack that looked like the belongings of a poor traveler, and rode toward Bayou Menard, looking for all the world like an elderly black drifter, harmless, slow, beneath notice. Reeves had used this technique dozens of times. The disguise was not just clothing. It was movement. It was posture. It was the way he held his head down, avoided eye contact, spoke softly, made himself smaller. A 6'2" man, over 200 pounds of muscle, who could shoot the cap off a bottle at 75 yards, transforming himself into someone that armed men would dismiss as worthless. That was the genius. That was the weapon nobody saw coming. At approximately 4 in the afternoon, Reeves came upon a clearing near a creek, 7 horses tied to a rope line, a campfire burning, and 7 white men sitting around it. No hoods now, just men, drinking, playing cards, talking loudly. One of them, a large man with a red beard and a scar on his left cheek, was telling a story about how the look on that farmer's face when they lit the cross was the funniest thing he had seen in years. Virgil Tate. Reeves rode up slowly, made his horse stumble deliberately, called out in a thin, tired voice, "Excuse me, sirs. I am lost. Been wandering these woods for 2 days. Could I trouble you for some water and directions to Fort Gibson?" The men looked up, saw an old black man on a broken-down horse. One of them laughed. "Look at this. Another lost darky wandering around the territory." Tate squinted at Reeves. "Where did you come from, old man?" "Was headed to Fort Gibson to find work. Got turned around at the creek. River all looked the same to me." Another man, younger, blond, stood up. "We ought to send him off. I do not like strangers around our camp." But Tate waved him down. "Relax. Look at him. He is harmless. Old man, come sit by the fire. We have water. You can rest a minute, then you head south. Fort Gibson is about 8 miles that way." He pointed. Reeves dismounted slowly, carefully, hobbled toward the fire like his legs ached, sat down on a log, accepted a tin cup of water, drank slowly, looked around the camp with eyes that missed nothing. 7 men, 4 rifles leaning against a fallen tree, within reach, but not in hand. 2 pistols in holsters on belts, hanging from saddle horns. 1 man had a knife on his belt. The horses were tired. The men were relaxed, overconfident, drunk. Reeves counted exits. The creek behind him, shallow, easy to cross. The tree line to the east, 30 yards. Good cover. The horses, bunched together, easy to spook with a single gunshot if necessary. He mapped the entire confrontation in his mind in less than 60 seconds. Then he kept talking. "Thank you kindly, sirs. You all hunters?" "Something like that," Tate said, grinning. The other men laughed. Reeves nodded slowly. "Good country for hunting. Lots of game out here. Lots of things to chase." "Indeed there is," Tate said. Reeves set down his cup, reached into his flour sack like he was looking for food. His hand closed around the grip of his Colt revolver. He stood up, and when he stood up, everything about him changed. His back straightened, his shoulders squared. His voice dropped 2 octaves and gained the weight of federal authority. His eyes locked onto Virgil Tate with an intensity that froze every man around that campfire. Virgil Tate, Danny Hollins, Roscoe Pratt, William Burke, Jacob Stemmons, Earl Cobb, Henry Lister. You are all under arrest by order of the United States District Court for the Western District of Arkansas. Judge Isaac C. Parker presiding. Federal warrants for conspiracy, intimidation, and assault under the enforcement acts of the United States Congress. You will stand. You will put your hands where I can see them. And you will come with me to Fort Smith. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds. But those 3 seconds contained a lifetime of assumptions collapsing. 7 white men who believed that their hoods made them untouchable, that the border made them invisible, that the color of their skin made them superior. And standing before them was a black man, taller than any of them, holding a revolver with the steady hand of a man who had done this more times than they could count, wearing the authority of the United States government like armor. Tate was the first to speak. "You are joking. You are a marshal?" Reeves pulled back his shirt to show the badge. "United States Deputy Marshal. And these warrants have your names on them. Every one of you." Tate looked at his men, looked at the rifles 30 feet away, calculated the odds. Reeves saw the calculation happening, saw Tate's eyes move toward the guns. "I would not," Reeves said quietly. "I have been shooting since before you learned to ride. You will not reach those rifles. And if any man here draws a weapon, I will put him down before his hand clears the holster. I have done it before. I do not enjoy it, but I will do it again." The blond man, Danny Hollins, stood up fast. "1 man against 7. You cannot take all of us." Reeves did not blink. "Would you like to find out? Because the first bullet goes to the first man who moves. And I promise you, Mr. Hollins, I do not miss." Hollins looked at Reeves, looked at the revolver, looked at Reeves's eyes, and sat back down. One by one, Reeves shackled them, wrists first, then connected by a long chain that ran from man to man. He did it calmly, methodically, the way a man does something he has practiced 1,000 times. Tate, the last to be shackled, looked at Reeves as the irons closed around his wrists. "How did you find us?" Reeves pulled the crumpled receipt from his pocket. "You bought rope and kerosene 3 days before you burned a cross on a family's door. You paid with your real name. And you left this in your campfire. You thought crossing the border would save you. But there is no border I will not cross. There is no territory I do not know. And there is no man I cannot find." Tate stared at the receipt. His face went pale. "Should have paid cash," one of the other prisoners muttered. Tate told him to shut up. Reeves gathered their weapons, loaded them onto the pack mule, secured the prisoners' horses to a lead rope, and began the long ride back to Fort Smith. 7 prisoners. 1 marshal. 60 miles of wilderness. Reeves rode at the front, revolver accessible, eyes constantly scanning. He did not sleep for the first 2 nights. When the prisoners needed water, he gave them water. When they needed food, he gave them food. He treated them like prisoners, not like animals, because Bass Reeves understood something that most men in his position would not have cared about. The law required due process. The law required that these men stand trial. The law required that their guilt be determined by a judge and jury, not by a marshal in the woods. And Reeves believed in the law with a conviction that most men reserve for religion. On the second night, Tate tried to talk. "You know what we do, do you not? What our organization stands for?" Reeves was checking the shackles, did not look up. "I know what you did to the Mills family. I know what you plan to do. And I know that Judge Parker will decide what happens next. You think putting us in front of a judge changes anything? There are thousands of us, millions who think the way we think. You cannot arrest an idea." Reeves finished checking the shackles, stood up, looked down at Tate. "I do not arrest ideas, Mr. Tate. I arrest men. Men who commit crimes, men who terrorize families, men who burn crosses on the doors of people whose only offense is existing. You can believe whatever you want to believe. But the moment you cross into my territory and break federal law, you become my business. And I always finish my business." Tate had no response to that. On the morning of September 21st, 1879, Bass Reeves rode into Fort Smith with 7 prisoners chained in a line behind him. The streets were not empty. Word had spread. People lined the road leading to the courthouse. Black families, white families, Cherokee traders, Creek farmers, soldiers from the garrison, all watching as a black marshal delivered 7 hooded terrorists to face justice. The prisoners kept their heads down. Their hoods were gone. Their rifles were gone. Their confidence was gone. All that remained were 7 men in chains, squinting in the morning sun, walking toward a courthouse where a judge was waiting who did not believe in mercy for men who preyed on the innocent. Judge Parker received the prisoners personally, reviewed the evidence, the torn hood fabric, the receipt from Van Buren, the testimony Reeves had collected from Clara Mills and George Sixskiller. Parker set trial for October. All 7 men were convicted. Tate received 15 years in federal prison. The others received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years. It was one of the first successful federal prosecutions of Klan-related violence in Indian Territory. And it happened because a black marshal did what no one else would do, what no one else could do. He rode into the darkness, alone, found the men who thought they were untouchable, and brought them back in chains. After the trial, a reporter from the Fort Smith Elevator newspaper approached Reeves. "Marshal Reeves, were you not afraid? Riding alone against 7 armed men?" Reeves considered the question. Fear is a useful thing. It keeps you sharp, keeps your eyes open and your hands steady. But fear is not the same as hesitation. I have a job. The judge gives me warrants. I bring back the men named on those warrants. Their number does not change the job. Their hoods do not change the job. Nothing changes the job. But they were Klan. They despise everything you are. Reeves almost smiled. They despise what they think I am. What I actually am is a United States Deputy Marshal. And that badge does not care about their opinions. Here is what the history books should tell you, but mostly do not. Bass Reeves served as a federal deputy marshal for 32 years. He arrested over 3,000 fugitives. He was never wounded in the line of duty, despite being involved in more gunfights than most soldiers see in a career. He brought in men of every race, every background, every level of danger. He even arrested his own son, Benny Reeves, for murder, because the law did not make exceptions, and neither did Bass. He worked under Judge Parker until Parker's death in 1896. He continued working as a lawman into the early 1900s, serving as a police officer in Muskogee, Oklahoma, after statehood. He died on January 12, 1910, at the age of 71. The Muskogee Times-Democrat wrote that he had been the most feared United States Marshal that was ever heard of in Indian Territory. And yet, for over a century, most Americans never learned his name. The same history books that celebrated Wyatt Earp, who was involved in one famous gunfight, treated Bass Reeves, who was involved in hundreds, as a footnote. The same culture that turned Billy the Kid, a murderer, into a legend, forgot the man who brought justice to a lawless frontier for 3 decades. That is not an accident. That is a choice. And it is a choice we can correct every time we tell this story. Drop a comment right now. Did you know about Bass Reeves before this video? And if you did not, why do you think his story was kept out of the mainstream for so long? I want to hear your thoughts. The KKK riders crossed into Indian Territory in September 1879, believing that a line on a map would protect them from consequences. They believed that the wilderness would swallow their crimes. They believed that no lawman, certainly no black lawman, would follow them into that darkness. They were wrong about everything. Bass Reeves tracked them across 60 miles of wilderness, read their campfires like open books, walked into their camp disguised as a harmless old man, then stood up, drew his weapon, and arrested all 7 of them without firing a single shot. He brought them back to Fort Smith in chains. They stood trial. They were convicted. and the message echoed through every hollow and hilltop in Indian Territory. There is no border that stops federal law. There is no hood that hides your identity from a man who reads the ground beneath your feet. And there is no amount of hate that can outrun the determination of Bass Reeves. When hooded terrorists thought a borderline would save them from justice, the Black Marshal rode in, warrants ready, and turned their escape into a federal capture. In the Wild West, no line on a map could shield hate from the man who brought every fugitive back. Bass Reeves proved that federal law rides farther than fear ever could. He did not need an army. He did not need revenge. He needed a badge, a warrant, a pair of handcuffs, and the unshakable belief that the law, applied equally, was the most powerful weapon any man could carry. Clara Mills and her family stayed on their homestead. James continued his blacksmithing. Their children grew up on that land. The oak tree where the riders had threatened to hang James stood in the front yard for decades. A reminder not of terror, but of the night terror was answered. Not with more terror. With law, with justice. With a man on horseback who rode alone into the dark because that was his job, and he had never once failed to do it. Thomas Johnson wanted to be a lawyer and never got the chance. But Bass Reeves became something just as powerful. He became proof. Proof that a black man born into slavery could become the most effective lawman on the American frontier. Proof that justice does not require permission from the powerful. Proof that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to ride into Indian Territory alone at dawn, because 7 men with hoods need to answer for what they did. Remember Bass Reeves. Remember the Mills family. Remember that the Klan rode into Indian Territory, expecting to find darkness, and instead found the one man in America they should have feared most. Not because he was violent, because he was relentless, because he was righteous, because he never stopped riding until every warrant was served and every fugitive was in chains. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. We are telling the stories that history tried to bury. The real stories of black courage, black excellence, and black justice in a country that was not built to celebrate them. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, Bass Reeves arrested over 3,000 outlaws in 32 years and never lost a fugitive. Not one. The greatest lawman in American history was a black man. And now you know his name.